everyone. Welcome to NeoUnrealist. I mean, here we go again. They're trying to resurrect Russia again. If it wasn't so predictable, it'd probably make me angry. But, at this point, this stuff is so Keystone Cops level. It's pathetic. It's just sad to watch CNN bite on deep state misinformation and just put out such obvious fake news. I mean, more or less, you've got deep state intelligence officials trying to use CNN to blame Donald Trump for putting at risk a highly placed U.S. asset in the Russian government. At 10 o'clock at night on September 9th, you had Jim Sciutto of CNN. He posted an article to CNN's website titled Exclusive, U.S. Extracted Top Spy from Inside Russia in 2017. And in that article, the former Obama administration official and current CNN reporter, Jim Sciutto, he writes that of a previously undisclosed secret mission that happened in 2017, where the United States, they exfiltrated what's described as one of its highest level covert sources inside the Russian government. In the article, Sciutto cited multiple Trump administration officials with direct knowledge. And he then goes on to single out one person directly involved in the discussions who claims the removal of the Russian was driven in part by concerns that President Donald Trump and his administration repeatedly mishandled classified intelligence and could contribute to exposing the covert source as their spy. So the decision to carry out the extraction, according to CNN, occurred soon after a May 2017 meeting in the Oval Office in which Trump discussed highly classified intelligence with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and the then Russian ambassador to the United States, Sergei Kislyak. So, already in this story, those two bits of info, we already know are garbage. One, we just know it's garbage on its face, and the other for reasons that you're going to soon hear about. It's the point of this video. First, that the exfiltration happened after Trump met with Lavrov and Kislyak and discussed an entirely unrelated topic to the story. That's not reporting a fact. That's reporting an event that happened that's coincidental. After Trump spoke to Lavrov and Kislyak about another matter, I might have stubbed my toe. What does one thing have to do with the other? Sciutto doesn't tie the two together at all. He's hoping that by merely saying it, by putting it in print, somehow that'd make it true. More likely the anonymous sources that he spoke to with the CIA were feeding him this line of bunk, and he bought it hook, line, and sinker. That's his problem, though. The first nonsense is what we have to deal with, because it's really the core premise of the story, and it's completely false. From looking into this, it's clear that this guy, and it's silly not to say his name at this point, because the whole world is reporting his name, this Oleg Smolenkov. Here they are talking about him in the Russian news by name, and that he lives in Virginia.
Смоленкова не предусматривала контактов с первыми лицами государства и участия.
For crying out loud, NBC all but drew a map to the front door of the guy's house. It's clear that as it stood in 2016, while Obama, not Trump, was president, mind you, that it was only a matter of time before he was discovered by the Russians, had he not been extracted. If they didn't know about him already. So as crazy as this sounds, think about it. It's actually advantageous to have a known mole in your ranks and then do nothing about it, because then you could feed that mole disinformation and make them at best, worthless to the CIA, because they'll just start distrusting the accuracy of his information. Or even better is if you can get the CIA to believe that the disinformation that you're feeding the guy is true. So the Russians are famous for their running that kind of hustle on the United States intelligence community. But back to the story. The reason why the Russians would know about this at all, they'd know because of the actions that were taken by the very same, probably the same so-called sources that Jim Sciutto was talking to for this story. Not by anything Donald Trump or his administration did. Keep this in mind. At no point in the entire story does CNN ever report Trump ever doing anything that impacted on the source, let alone expose them to any risk. First of all, the fact that the current and former members of the CIA are talking to CNN at all about this covert operation it's unforgivable. Think about it. These leakers, they should be ruthlessly hunted down as they're the ones who actually put the source at risk. Remember that. The information, the details that led to the source being discovered didn't come from Trump. It came from media leaks and information that was put out as a result of the Trump-Russia story. The first news outlet to throw cold water on Jim Sciutto and CNN's report was, if you can believe this, the New York Times. And this happened almost right away. They reported that the CIA cultivated this mid-level Russian official over a decade ago, who, as luck would have it, then rose to the ranks of the Russian government. And according to the New York Times, the source eventually got access to the highest level of the Kremlin. In fact, the New York Times, they're being criticized for perhaps revealing too much about the source even now in their reporting, saying that he was recruited and his level of access just makes it easier for people to narrow down who the mole was. The big problem for Jim Sciutto and CNN was that the New York Times reports that the U.S. officials, they became worried about their Kremlin the risk he was under in 2016. Why? Because he was the source that the deep state was actually citing to push the whole Putin personally approved interference in the 2016 election narrative. And the revelations in late 2016 about the details of that activity is what led the news media to pick up on details about the CIA's Kremlin source. The level of detail, that was provided into the decision-making at the highest level of the Russian government that was appearing in the media meant that the mole had to become someone at that level. So this is not a big circle of people who are in a position to know what Vladimir Putin was doing with regard to covert operations, on a first-hand or even a second-hand basis that are in the Russian government. The New York Times reported that CIA officials, they were so worried about the risk to their source that they decided in late 2016 to offer the guy to extract him out of Russia. So to their great frustration, though, the CIA he refused to leave. He didn't want to leave Russia, according to the CIA. He was saying that he was citing family concerns for not wanting to go. And the source's refusal, was so adamant that the CIA, because of that refusal, they began to distrust the guy. Obviously, if they were fearing that he was basically feeding them disinformation, perhaps he'd been turned by the Russians and was now a double agent. The New York Times destroyed Jim Sciutto's claim right there. If the decision to pull the guy out had already been made in 2016 because of the media's inquiries indicating that they were closing in on who the Kremlin source was, who was president of the United States in 2016 again? Oh yeah, it was Barack Obama, not Donald Trump. Donald Trump, he would not become president until January 20th of the following year, in 2017. Donald Trump in 2016 did not even have access yet to the intelligence about the CIA source, and for that matter, the conversation that Jim Sciutto cites as the rationale for the CIA deciding to get the source out of Russia wouldn't happen until the following year, months later. So more or less, the CIA had already decided in 2016 the source was at risk. They wanted him out of there. It was only the source's stubborn refusal to leave that prevented that operation to exfiltrate him going forward. When further media inquiries were happening, over the course of the next few months, because of the avalanche of Russian collusion stories, remember that time? It was all Russia, Russia, Russia. Hasn't really stopped for almost 3 years now. So note the key thing here, which the New York Times reporting is revealing. It wasn't Donald Trump who did anything to make the CIA decide that their source had to be yanked out. It was specifically the release of information about the sources and methods by members of the U.S. intelligence community, leaking that crap to the media in order to justify their narrative about a massive Russian interference into the U.S. 2016 election. It wasn't Trump, it was the intel community itself, the deep state, in conjunction with their media allies, in their mad quixotic quest to make sure that the bad orange man wouldn't get into the Oval Office, and once he was in there, to get him out. They were the ones that revealed the very information that the media used to ferret out who the CIA's Kremlin mole could be. So understand the situation that the source was in at the time, from his perspective. You are more or less a spy for the CIA. You are betraying your country, in this case Russia. The same Russia that has demonstrated it can and will reach turncoats even after they've escaped to the West. You go to the guy and you say, hey, we want you to leave your country. We want you to abandon every member of your extended family, every friend you've ever made, forever, right there on a moment's notice. Then they want this guy to move to a country who, let's face it, whose government couldn't even protect Jeffrey Epstein in a supposedly secure facility. Jim Sciutto thinks that this is like CNN asking him to move across the Potomac River from Virginia to Maryland, and the guy could go, okay. That is a big deal, to ask someone to leave their country, become a known traitor, and have to look over their shoulder for the rest of their life, have somebody tasting their tea every time they drink some, on the off chance there might be some polonium in it. You think this guy, you think he even told his wife what he was doing, or his kids what he was doing with the CIA all those years? Not if he had any brains. No, he couldn't just drop everything and run to the United States right away. Of course it took him a few months to come around. He probably had to convince his wife at the very least, even if she didn't know what he was doing, even if she did know what he was doing for the CIA all those years, that he had to probably convince her that they had to go to the U.S. In any event, CNN and the New York Times left out a lot of information, probably because their sources were telling them, hey, we got to protect this Russian source. That was a lie, though, because they were really shaping a narrative, and the less known in the U.S. media about the guy, the better to protect that narrative. Just the fact that he exists is all they want you to know. The bottom line, the foreign media, they're under no such limitations, and they're just reporting everything you want to know about this guy. I mean, it's so obvious that the Russians know about the guy. I mean, that they've in all likelihood known about him for a long time by now. I mean, follow me on this. Just from what the CNN and New York Times and NBC wrote, the source had to be high up in the Russian government, and that the source agreed to get out of Russia in May of 2017. That's what they wrote. So the operation had to have happened during either May or June 2017. The New York Times said that the source was recruited more than a decade ago, that they did not work directly for Putin but were near him. What that means is it had to be someone in the Presidential Executive Office, also known as the Presidential Administration in Russia. Somebody like that, someone high up in the Presidential Executive Office. They don't just disappear without anybody noticing it. Imagine if instead of being fired or resigning, like John Bolton yesterday, what if instead Bolton just suddenly disappeared and his entire family without any explanation? That'd definitely be in the news. So people started looking for big names who disappeared from the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the Ministry of Defense or the Presidential Executive Office in or around May or June of 2017. Sure enough, in September of that year, a Russian media outlet called the Daily Storm, not the Daily Stormer, I'm sure the name is similar, but the Daily Storm in Russia, they reported that a guy named Oleg Smolenkov and his family, that Smolenkov was a long-serving diplomat and an official in Putin's presidential executive office, and he just disappeared. Oleg Smolenkov, his wife, and their 3 kids, they went to Montenegro on vacation, and on June 14th, 2017, they were never seen or heard from again. The Russians, clearly they want to know what happened to the guy. They investigated what happened to the person in Montenegro, and right away, at first they came to no conclusion, or at least that's the public word, that they closed the investigation. It was inconclusive. They had no idea what happened to the Smolenkovs in Montenegro. Smolenkov was more or less the aide of a guy named Yuri Ushakov. And it was not Smolenkov who was actually in Putin's inner circle. It was his boss, this Yuri Ushakov. He was that guy. So the CIA, they had a guy who worked for a guy who was in tight with the guy, Putin. So wherever this Ushakov guy went, wherever he was posted or assigned to, it seems like Smolenkov was, you usually have a guy that when you get promoted to up the ranks. You bring your guys with you. Smolenkov, it seems, was that person that wherever Ushakov went, he's the guy that he took along for the ride. So when Ushakov was an ambassador in the United States, Smolenkov was just, his second secretary. And that was probably when the CIA recruited him, while he was working for Yuri Ushakov in the United States. And there are court records of traffic violations in 2006 in Virginia for one Oleg Borisovich Smolenkov, born June 1st, 1969. And Oleg B. Smolenkov is listed in open records as having served as second secretary in the listing for His Excellency Yuri V. Ushakov, Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary at the Embassy of the Russian Federation. The real problem in this story comes up when you realize that Oleg Smolenkov, the guy who worked in the Kremlin for Yuri Ushakov, was an advisor to Putin, and he was supposed to have mysteriously vanished during a family vacation to Montenegro. Well, Oleg Smolenkov and his wife, Antonina, they're listed as having bought a house in the Virginia, D.C. suburbs in June of 2018 for the princely sum of $925,000. And not bad for a couple of Russians who supposedly vanished off the face of the earth while on vacation in Montenegro a year earlier. It looks like they set up a revocable trust. It's called the Partridge Joint Revocable Trust. Looks like a token attempt to hide the ownership of the $1 million house in the D.C. suburbs. But right there in Northern Virginia, in close proximity to Langley, the home of the CIA, when NBC News took a trip down to the address, went to the Smolenkov's house, they rang the doorbell. 5 minutes later, two young men in an SUV, they came racing up the street, parked right next to the reporter's car, started asking him, saying that they're friends of the Russian, and they want to know what the NBC reporter was doing there. So, you think the NBC reporter got the right house? When he walks up to the door, rings the bell, and in 5 minutes, two feds show up in an SUV and start asking him what he's doing? The guy who is supposed to be one of the top sources that the U.S. had in the Russian government, who was supposed to have disappeared in Montenegro, was living outside Washington, D.C. under his own name, in plain sight. If you don't think the Russians knew where this guy was, you're nuts. Because if NBC News was able to find his address and walk up to his door, a simple public record search, for God's sakes, you can bet the Russians knew. According to Tass, the Russian news agency, the Russian government concluded not long that after Smolenkov disappeared that he was living in another country. And this is not an unreasonable assumption to make, because you have to also realize that the wife, she had two Russian social media accounts, and they were logged into a week after they supposedly disappeared, so they knew that they were out there. In any event, the CNN story about somehow Trump was going to give away the Russian spy was somehow the rationale behind pulling Smolenkov out. It's bogus. The CIA wanted to pull him out in 2016 because it was only Smolenkov's refusal that delayed him leaving by just a few months. The New York Times and NBC, they both say it. There's no evidence whatsoever that Trump ever brought this guy up with anyone. Once again, CNN fake news. What this really looks like is about a half dozen or more deep staters trying to set up a preemptive leak in the media just before the Department of Justice's Inspector General's report is set to come out on the origins of the Trump-Russia investigation that justifies the reliance on the Steele dossier, to obtain FISA warrants to surveil members of the Trump campaign like Carter Page. Because this was the guy that they were using to prop up that story. Recall that as of right now, it looks like just about every phony lead that was used to gin this story up was actually generated by a British, a US, an Australian, or an Italian intelligence and diplomatic assets. George Papadopoulos, Carter Page, and these people, they were approached by guys like Alexander Downer. He's an Australian diplomat who directed money to the Clinton Foundation. He he reports through his government that Papadopoulos had a conversation with Joseph Mifsud. Mifsud's an Italian intelligence asset who's cooperated with many Western intelligence services. So, Alexander Downer, the Australian diplomat, says that Papadopoulos, in a conversation with Mifsud, an Italian intelligence a cooperator, that he told Papadopoulos the Russians had dirt on Hillary Clinton. Mifsud, again, like I said, an Italian intel asset, primarily, but a known Western asset. He says that through his attorney, he was told by superiors in Western intelligence agencies to introduce Papadopoulos to the Russians. Stefan Halper, a known U.S. intelligence asset who was paid in excess of $1 million. Their excuse was to write so-called research papers of zero value. I mean, how'd you like that gig for $1 million? To write book reports for a cool $1 million. Stefan Halper, they sicked him on Carter Page. Hell, even the Russian lawyer at the infamous Trump Tower meeting with Don Jr., she was more a Fusion GPS operative than a Russian government asset. I mean, the dubious paperwork that she was carrying to hand over to the Trump campaign, it was generated by Fusion GPS. The real purpose of that meeting seemed to have been just to put a Trump campaign officials in a room with a Russian and having them hand over documents with worthless information, just so they could be pointed to and they could shout collusion, collusion, collusion. So without this highly placed Russian source, Oleg Smolenkov, there's literally no way to even claim that the Russian government did anything with the Trump administration in 2016. Since according to the Mueller report, the highly placed Russian source is the one that was used to justify the conclusion that Putin personally directed the operation, as well as the simple fact that the already thin predicate for the investigation of Trump campaign officials just existing at all, it disappears entirely if all the spooks and assets that interacted with the Trump campaign members were in reality Western diplomatic and intel assets, like Downer, Mifsud, and Halper. So on the eve of the IG report, where it's going to go into the predicate for even looking at the Trump campaign people at all of a sudden, 5 anonymous or more intelligence community sources, they all go to Jim Sciutto and tell him this bogus CIA yanked a high-ranking mole out of Russia because Orange Man bad story. I mean, it tells me that they're trying to protect their narrative of this man being vital to the Trump-Russia story, because right now, the entire case for even taking the Steele dossier or Russian election interference is more than a joke, rests on the credibility of Oleg Smolenkov. So if that were the case, if this guy was so critical, you'd think they wouldn't drop him in Virginia to live out in the open under his real name, or even some cub reporter with NBC could walk right up to his front door. That's just my opinion. That's all for this NeoUnrealist. If you want to help the channel, do me a favor, hit like for this video, leave a comment below, mash down the subscribe button if you're not already subbed to the channel, and click on that notification bell beside it. You put it on the all setting to keep up with the newer content. If you want to contribute directly to the channel and toss your hard-earned dollars, your rubles, into the tip jar, follow the links below to subscribe to our PayPal. If you watch this on BitChute, you can just click on the green tip pledge button on the video player. But if you're still hearing this, that means you've sat through the money-grubbing capitalist portion of the video, the long, meandering monologue on the Byzantine interactions between current and former intel officials with TDS feeding lapdog media like CNN total bullcrap. You've got real mental fortitude and a strong stomach for this sort of thing. So, much respect. Thanks for watching.
You are fake news.